This day was meant to be a relatively carefree holiday. Instead, 30,000 people died in what has been called the first modern disaster. That day, the people of Lisbon had just filled up the town's churches to take part in that morning's mass when the first tremor struck.
15 minutes later, the main shock reached Lisbon, flattening the entire Baixa district, the ancient center of town. Streets were torn apart, crisscrossed by massive fissures up to 5 meters wide as dust filled the air. The dust would be replaced by smoke as fires started in the rubble. The survivors, not knowing any better, made their way to the waterfront. An English merchant describes what followed.
On a sudden, I heard a general outcry. The sea is coming in. We shall all be lost. In an instant, there appeared at some small distance a vast body of water, rising, as it were, like a mountain. It came on foaming and roaming, and rushed toward the shore with such impetuosity that though we all immediately ran for our lives as fast as possible, many were swept away.
An hour and a half after the tragedy began, a massive tsunami had arrived to aid in the destruction of Lisbon. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented in living memory. The nerve centers of Portuguese trade and government no longer existed. The Casa de India, through which the colonial trade flow was gone, as was the royal palace, customs office, the Ribeira de Naus shipyard, which built the biggest Portuguese ships, the courts, various government ministries, the brand new opera house, as well as countless markets and churches. Entire families were wiped out. Grand libraries and ancient archives burnt to the ground or were swallowed up by the sea. Every aspect of life in Lisbon was disrupted. But what mattered in the hours after the tragedy was not who died, but who survived.
The royal family had left Lisbon and were in the nearby town of Belém when the earthquake happened. Though they were not in the epicenter of the tragedy, the king, José I, was sufficiently terrified by what he had experienced that day that he never slept in anything more solid than a tent for the rest of his life. While the royals were still brushing off dust, an absolutely iconic character came to check on them. Sebastião José de Carvalho Mel, the future Marquis of Pombal, presently just minister in government, found the king lost in anguish and confusion. The king said, "Subscribe to retrospect." No, but seriously, he said,
"What is to be done about this divine act?"
And the Marquis replied, allegedly,
"Bury the dead and heal the living."
In that very same moment, the king decided to place his trust in the Marquis and gave him limitless authority to deal with the disaster. The Marquis raced to Lisbon, where he started putting together crews of whatever people he could find to put out fires and drag people out from under the rubble. He ordered the army into Lisbon to relieve the decimated local garrison. He organized deliveries of food from the countryside and executions of thieves found to be looting, both of which were to be carried out by the army. Dead bodies, contrary to Christian norms, were to be buried en masse at sea to prevent the spread of disease. He had clearly made some wise choices, and within days, order was more or less restored. However, as the shock of what happened wore off, old issues came bubbling up to the surface.
Before the earthquake, Portugal was a bit of a mess. Though it was the first to play the colonizing empire game, by the 18th century it had been eclipsed by countless other powers. The country had stagnated after centuries of rule by a coalition of despotic, self-absorbed kings, dogmatic Catholic clergymen, and nobles allergic to the mere mention of change. Any wealth generated from the colonies, such as the gold mines of Brazil, where slaves toiled around the clock, usually dying within months, was spent on luxury goods from abroad. Portugal itself remained largely underdeveloped and backward. Literacy was so low that common jobs requiring the ability to read and write had to be filled by foreigners. The Inquisition was still burning people alive, and the country's main university in Coimbra taught an almost medieval syllabus. The Marquis Exposed to Enlightenment ideas during his time as a diplomat, despised the status quo. The Enlightenment was an 18th century movement that sought to prioritize reason as the primary way of understanding the world, rather than other systems of belief like religion. To the Marquis, the entrenched nobility and unenlightened clergy were ideological enemies. His handling of the earthquake earned him the king's seemingly endless favor, and he was eager to use that support to rebuild both Lisbon and Portugal in his own image. The church was the first enemy. Preachers like Father Gabriel Malagrida claimed the earthquake was divine punishment for Lisbon's sins. In his own words,
"Learn, O Lisbon, that the destroyers of our houses, palaces, churches, and convents, the cause of death of so many people, and the flames that devour vast treasures, are your abominable sins, and not comets, stars, vapors, and exhalations, and similar natural phenomena."
This soured the mood, as people felt that until they repented for some unknown sins, God would just keep sending more destruction their way. The Marquis did not think that this was helpful, and so had Malagrida exiled to some faraway corner of the country. But he was just one priest. Much more significantly, in 1759, the Jesuit order, a major organization within the Catholic Church, was effectively dismantled within Portugal. The Jesuits had controlled most of the education and a fair amount of the commerce within Portugal, but the Marquis said they had to go, so they had to go. He also weakened the Inquisition and ended some of the worst censorship. The Marquis threatened to convert Portugal to Protestantism unless the Pope approved these changes, which he did. The Church, long coexisting with the state, was now sidelined.
the earthquake also caused a crisis of faith in Europe. Catholics in particular could not understand why Lisbon, of all places, was the target of divine punishment. The fact that the earthquake happened on All Saints' Day, one of the most important Christian holidays, and more specifically at a time when people were in church, added to their confusion. In the minds of Catholics, catastrophes like this were meant for sinful cities like London and Paris, certainly not Lisbon with all its clergymen and churches.
There was the whole idea of God's strongest soldiers getting his toughest battles, but it was just so hard to reconcile with what the people were hearing about how awful and destructive this earthquake was. And people were hearing quite a lot of it because the entirety of Europe was talking about it. In addition to the enlightened and scientific response led by the Marquis, another reason why this earthquake is considered the first modern disaster is that it became a media spectacle.
Newspapers all over Europe reported on it within a month, provoking quite a lot of shock and pity. Unfortunately, disaster tourism developed, as those who could afford it traveled to Lisbon to gawk at the ruins. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau wrote about the quake and tried to make sense of what it meant. Even foreign governments got involved. The British Parliament voted to help Portugal recover with a payment of £100,000 and a shipment of various goods. And while this may be explained by the fact that the two were old allies, other countries helped too.
In fact, this was basically the first time that governments organized a humanitarian aid effort for a totally foreign country out of sheer sympathy and sense that this was the right thing to do, which again leads back to the changes associated with the Enlightenment. Nowhere would the changes brought on by the Enlightenment be more pronounced than in Lisbon. After mitigating the fallout of the disaster, the next step was to rebuild what was destroyed.
The Marquis worked with a team of architects to come up with a plan for the reconstruction of the Baixa district. Tight medieval streets filled with ancient dwellings were to give way to a grid pattern of wide boulevards. Under the streets, sewage and drainage systems were planned. The buildings themselves were to be nearly identical, rectangular city blocks in keeping with the Enlightenment ideal of order through uniformity. Their uniform design had tangible advantages, as many parts could be prefabricated and mass-produced, increasing speeds and decreasing costs. But more importantly, the plans included a specially designed wooden frame embedded within the masonry. The advantage of this design was that the wood, being a little flexible, could absorb the energy of the earthquake, whereas the masonry would protect the wood from any fires that could break out. The entire quarter rested on a foundation made of large tree trunks, which allows the houses to slide around a bit on top of it, further reducing the damage brought on by an earthquake. This was actually the first example of earthquake-resistant architecture in Europe. Only Japan had any experience with this at that point.
Disputes with property owners meant that the reconstruction of the Baisha district had to wait for 2.5 years. When it finally commenced in 1758, it continued without major incident. In the meantime, the Marquis continued implementing his own vision. His remaining enemy were the aristocracy, which really did not like him. To intimidate them into shutting up, he had some of the most powerful nobles in the country executed based on trumped-up charges. An incident involving the king being attacked while on the way back from a party mutated into an assassination plot allegedly hatched by the people who threw this party, the Tavoras. They confessed to it after being tortured and were killed gruesomely. While this wasn't a good look, trying to reform the education system and kickstarting Portuguese manufacturing certainly was. Isn't it great having complex historical characters? You never quite know if you want to stab them in the eye or shake their hand.
By 1775, the new Baisha quarter was ready, and a massive celebration was held to inaugurate it. It seemed that the Marquis's dream of a new Portugal was becoming reality. Unfortunately, the king died 2 years later, and with him went the Marquis. The new monarch, Queen Maria I, dismissed him and also had charges brought against him for crimes both real and imagined. His reforms were largely rolled back as the church and nobility returned to power.
The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 changed history. What's interesting for me about it is that so many of these changes were good. Lisbon became an objectively better place to live in, especially in the Baisha district. Portugal as a whole took a great step forward, even if most of the useful reforms were rolled back. Europe as a whole was sobered by this experience, helping weaken the spell of organized religion. The entire field of seismology, the scientific study of earthquakes, can trace its origins back to this disaster. In the long run, countless lives were saved because of what happened on the 1st of November, 1755. All of these changes, though, are not worth the lives of tens of thousands of people, at least to me. Perhaps this earthquake and the man who responded to it deserve to be remembered in the same way, as disasters with a silver lining. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like more, subscribe and check out my channel. Leave your thoughts down below and I'll see you again soon. This has been Ivan with Retrospect History. Bye. The changes brought on by the Enlightenment people.